The late afternoon sun poured through the tall glass windows of a modest film studio in Los Angeles. Crew members moved quickly, wires being taped down, cameras being adjusted, and lights being tested. The scene was supposed to be ordinary, a rehearsal day with no audience, just professionals preparing for another moment of Hollywood magic. But behind the hum of work and the clatter of equipment, tension began to stir. A young actor, no more than 22, stood awkwardly at the edge of the set. He was new, fresh out of drama school, still clutching his sides with nervous energy. His lines were few, his role minor, but his dream of standing here beside stars he admired was enormous. Yet instead of encouragement, he found himself the target of ridicule. A man in his 30s, a production assistant known more for his arrogance than his skill, had locked onto the boy like a predator sensing weakness. "You call that acting?" the assistant sneered, his voice carrying across the set with deliberate cruelty. A few crew members froze, unsure whether to laugh or look away. The young actor's face flushed crimson as he looked down at his script. "No wonder you're stuck as a background character. My niece in kindergarten could deliver those lines better." The bully leaned closer, smirking with satisfaction as the boy shrank back, fumbling with his papers. For the bully, this wasn't about the boy, it was about dominance. He had found an easy victim, someone he could belittle publicly to inflate his own fragile sense of power. His laughter rang hollow, echoing through the stage, leaving a bitter taste in the air. Those nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one stepped forward. Hollywood, after all, was filled with whispered warnings. Don't get involved, don't risk your job, don't draw attention. The victim's lips trembled as he tried to offer a reply, but the bully cut him off with a mocking imitation of his voice. "Oh, please, don't embarrass yourself further," he said, rolling his eyes. "Stick to carrying coffee cups, you might have some talent there." Laughter erupted from two others at the back, not because they found it funny, but because they didn't want to be the next target. Fear makes accomplices of the innocent. The boy's hands tightened around his script until the edges crumpled, his chest heaving as he fought to keep tears from surfacing. To the bully, this was victory. Public humiliation was his sport. He wasn't interested in improvement or teaching. He was feeding his ego at the expense of another human soul. And with each cutting remark, his grin widened, convinced that no one would challenge him. What made it worse was the silence. Silence is a dangerous thing. It gives cruelty room to breathe, space to grow. Those who wanted to say something, perhaps a kind word, perhaps a defense, remained still, trapped by the fear of losing favor, of being labeled difficult in an industry that thrived on power dynamics. And so, in that vacuum of courage, the bully flourished. The young actor lowered his gaze, the shine of his dream dimming with every second. Hollywood, he thought in that moment, wasn't a place of inspiration but of cruelty disguised as humor. His dream of becoming a storyteller, of sharing emotions with an audience, felt fragile, ready to shatter under the weight of a man who thrived on destruction. The bully didn't just want to embarrass him. He wanted to crush him so completely that he would never rise again. And for a moment, it seemed like he might succeed. But stories have a way of turning when you least expect them to. For in the corner of the studio, leaning quietly against a wall, someone else was watching. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. His presence was almost invisible to those who weren't paying attention. Yet he was there, taking in every word, every insult, every cruel laugh. His face remained calm, his eyes steady, but beneath that stillness was a storm waiting for the right moment to move. That man was Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves stood quietly in the corner of the studio, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, like someone who had mastered the art of being present without demanding attention. He had arrived earlier than expected, slipping into the room without fanfare, as he often did. For most, his presence had gone unnoticed. The crew was too busy adjusting equipment, the young actor too caught in his humiliation, and the bully too absorbed in his performance of cruelty. But Keanu saw everything. His dark eyes, calm yet piercing, followed the exchange with measured intensity. He wasn't just watching the bully's actions. He was studying the way the young actor's shoulders caved inward, the tremble of his hands, the shame flickering across his face. Keanu had known that feeling before. He recognized the crushing weight of mockery, the sting of being singled out, the loneliness of standing defenseless in front of others. For a moment, Keanu said nothing. He didn't believe in rushing to intervene, nor did he think raising his voice would solve anything. Instead, He leaned lightly against a steel pillar, his hands in the pockets of his worn black jacket. He knew bullies thrived on spectacle, on the instant rush of power when their target broke down or fought back. But what they couldn't handle, what they never expected, was someone who could undo them without anger, without a single raised fist. Keanu let the bully's words roll through the space, his silence not of weakness but of patience. His mind flickered back to his own early years in Hollywood, to the harsh words of critics who told him he'd never make it, who called him wooden, flat, undeserving. He remembered the nights he sat alone in small apartments, wondering if his dreams were worth the ridicule. And now, watching this young actor wilt under the same kind of cruelty, Keanu felt a responsibility stir inside him. The room began to notice him, though not all at once. A camera operator caught sight of the tall, familiar figure in the corner and straightened instinctively, whispering something to a grip nearby. The whispers spread in quiet ripples. Keanu Reeves was here. And suddenly the air shifted. It was as if the walls themselves were aware, leaning in to see what he would do. The bully, however, remained oblivious for a moment longer, still reveling in his performance. He mocked the young actor's trembling hands, exaggerating them with clownish gestures. "Look at this," he jeered, shaking his own hands as if struck with fear. "Stage fright already. Pathetic." His laugh rang out once more, but this time it faltered at the edges. Something about the room had changed. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It carried weight, a strange gravity pressing down on everyone present. The young actor risked a glance upward and froze. His eyes widened slightly as they landed on Keanu Reeves. The boy had grown up watching him, Neo in The Matrix, John Wick, Ted Logan. To him, Keanu wasn't just a celebrity. He was a symbol of resilience, of someone who had endured more than his fair share of heartbreak and loss, yet continued to stand tall. For a brief moment, hope flickered in the boy's eyes, though he dared not believe it. Keanu gave no grand gesture, no dramatic nod, just a steady gaze that seemed to say, "I see you. I hear you. Hold on." It was enough to stop the boy from breaking. His hands loosened just slightly around the crumpled script, as if anchored by that silent acknowledgement. The bully finally noticed the hush, the way the crew had turned their attention toward the corner. He followed their gaze, his confident smirk faltering when he realized who stood there. Keanu Reeves. Not an assistant director, not a background extra, but the Keanu Reeves, an actor whose very name carried a reputation for humility, respect, and quiet strength. The bully tried to mask his sudden discomfort with another laugh, but it came out brittle, hollow. "What?" he said defensively, his eyes darting back toward Keanu. "It's just a joke. Can't the kid take a joke?" But even as he said it, his bravado was slipping. There was no humor left in the air, only the heavy awareness that someone far greater was watching. And Keanu didn't need to speak yet. His silence was already dismantling the bully's performance, piece by piece. The bully's face stiffened as he realized all eyes had shifted toward Keanu Reeves. For a fleeting second, his confidence cracked, but pride wouldn't let him retreat. Pride, after all, is the fuel of cruelty. And so, like a cornered animal lashing out, he doubled down. Turning back toward the trembling young actor, he forced a grin that looked more like a grimace. "See," he said loudly, waving a dismissive hand toward Keanu as if his presence didn't matter. "Even he thinks you're pathetic. Look at him, just standing there. Not even worth his time to correct you." His words sliced the air, sharper now, tinged with desperation. The young actor's shoulders slumped again, the fragile spark of hope Keanu had offered beginning to flicker. The bully sensed it, and he pounced. "Why don't you just admit it?" he sneered, stepping closer. "You don't belong here. Hollywood isn't for weaklings. You should quit before you embarrass yourself in front of the whole world." The studio grew colder, or at least it felt that way. Crew members shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others pretending to adjust equipment that didn't need adjusting. The victim tried to step back, but the bully followed, closing the gap, looming over him like a shadow. The boy's script slipped from his trembling hands, pages scattering across the polished floor. The sound of paper fluttering should have been insignificant, but in that tense silence, it echoed like thunder. The bully smirked, eyes gleaming with triumph, and bent to snatch one of the pages off the floor. He held it up mockingly, clearing his throat. "Let's see if I can do it better," he announced, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Then, in an exaggerated falsetto, he began reading the young actor's lines, stumbling on purpose, stumbling in a way that invited laughter. A couple of uneasy chuckles broke out, the kind people give when fear forces them to join in cruelty. To the bully, it was enough. He fed on those scraps of validation like a starving man at a feast. The young actor's chest heaved, his eyes burning with humiliation. His dream, the one he had nurtured for years, the one that had carried him through sleepless nights and endless rejections, was crumbling in front of him. He wanted to protest, to tell the bully to stop, but his voice was trapped somewhere deep in his throat, strangled by fear. His fists clenched at his sides, not in readiness to fight, but in the helpless frustration of someone who had no weapons against ridicule. Every second stretched painfully long, and the boy felt like the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating him with shame. The bully's laughter grew louder, more forced, as if to drown out the unspoken disapproval lingering in the room. He crumpled the script page in his fist and tossed it at the boy's chest, the paper bouncing off with a cruel finality. "Pathetic," he said again, his voice lower now, a hiss meant only for his victim's ears. But the moment he turned to sneer once more, he caught sight of Keanu Reeves. This time, the actor wasn't just standing silently. Keanu had shifted his weight forward, his arms no longer tucked in his jacket pockets. He had straightened to his full height, his presence unmistakable, his gaze fixed firmly on the bully. It wasn't anger that filled Keanu's eyes, it was something far more disarming. Calm, steadiness, authority without aggression. It was the kind of gaze that stripped away pretense, that forced a man to see the reflection of his own actions for what they truly were. The bully faltered, his smirk twitching at the edges, though he tried desperately to hold it together. He laughed again, but the sound was brittle, empty. "What?" he asked, addressing Keanu this time, his voice cracking slightly. "You think I'm wrong? You think this kid deserves to be here?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence was louder than any shouted confrontation. The crew sensed it too. The tide was turning. No longer was the bully in control of the room. No longer was his cruelty the center of attention. All eyes had shifted to Keanu, and in that subtle shift, the bully's performance was unraveling. He had tried to push further, to cement his dominance with louder insults and crueler gestures, but instead, he had drawn himself closer to the edge of his own undoing. And everyone could feel it coming. The room had gone still. The bully's last taunt hung in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate, curling into every corner of the studio. His voice, once sharp and commanding, now sounded brittle, almost pleading, as if daring Keanu Reeves to challenge him. But Keanu didn't rush. He had never been a man of rash movements. Instead, he stepped forward with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Each stride was unhurried yet deliberate, his boots striking the polished floor with a weight that seemed to echo louder than it should. Every eye in the room followed him. The crew stopped pretending to busy themselves, the young actor froze mid-breath, and even the bully, desperate to hold on to a smirk, couldn't help but lean back slightly as Keanu approached. There was no raised voice, no theatrical display. Keanu didn't need them. His presence alone shifted the balance of power. When he reached the young actor's side, Keanu crouched down, not to the bully, not to the crowd, but to the boy. He bent slowly, gathering the scattered pages of the crumpled script, smoothing them with his hands. His movements were deliberate, careful, as though every word on those pages mattered. As he stood, he handed the script back to the boy with a quiet nod. The boy's wide, tear-glossed eyes locked on Keanu's, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them. Reassurance, dignity, a reminder that his worth wasn't defined by mockery. Only then did Keanu turn toward the bully. His face was calm, his eyes steady, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, yet it carried through the entire studio like a bell cutting through fog. "You know," Keanu began, his tone conversational, almost gentle, "I've met a lot of people like you." He didn't raise a hand, didn't point a finger, yet his words landed squarely on the bully's chest. People who think power is about tearing others down, about making someone feel small so they can feel bigger. It works for a while, sure, but in the end, Keanu paused, tilting his head slightly, his eyes never leaving the man. In the end, all it really shows is how afraid you are. afraid that someone else's light will outshine yours. His words weren't cruel, but they cut sharper than any insult. The crew exchanged glances, some nodded subtly, others exhaled as though releasing a truth they'd been holding back. The bully shifted uncomfortably, his smirk collapsing into something closer to a grimace. The bully tried to recover, to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. "I was just joking," he muttered, shrugging as if that erased the venom of his words. Keanu took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them, his presence commanding yet never aggressive. "A joke," Keanu repeated softly. "A joke makes people laugh together. What you did wasn't a joke. It was cruelty dressed up as humor. And the only person laughing was you." The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on the bully until he shifted from foot to foot, his confidence unraveling. He glanced around, searching for an ally, but found none. The crew, once cowed into silence, now stood united in quiet judgment, their gazes fixed firmly on him. The bully's eyes darted back to Keanu, but he couldn't meet his steady gaze for long. He looked down, suddenly aware of how small he felt. Keanu let the moment breathe before speaking again, his voice softer now, almost compassionate. "You don't have to be this guy," he said, and for a brief moment, the harshness in the air cracked open into something unexpected. It wasn't condemnation alone, it was an invitation to change, to choose dignity over cruelty. Keanu had dismantled him, yes, but not with fists or fury. He had exposed the emptiness of his cruelty with nothing more than calm truth. The crew knew it. The young actor felt it. And the bully, despite his shame, couldn't deny it. He had been destroyed, not through violence, not through humiliation, but through kindness that revealed his own weakness. The bully's bravado was crumbling by the second. His smirk, once so effortless, now looked like a strained mask barely clinging to his face. His shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of every pair of eyes in the room, each crew member silently condemning him with their stares. The laughter he had relied on, the nervous chuckles that had fueled his cruelty, was gone. All that remained was silence, and silence in the face of truth is louder than any crowd's roar. Keanu hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened, hadn't raised so much as a finger. And yet, standing there calm and composed, he had dismantled the bully's power completely. The bully shifted uneasily, trying to shrug off the moment with another weak excuse. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered, forcing a laugh that died in his throat. But no one laughed with him this time. The echo of his cruelty lingered, making his words sound hollow. The young actor, who only minutes before had been trembling with humiliation, now stood a little taller, his script clutched tightly in his hands. His face was still flushed, his hands still shaky, but something in his posture had changed. He was no longer shrinking into himself. Keanu's presence had given him the courage to endure, and now the bully's words no longer carried the same sting. The boy glanced at Keanu, who gave him a barely perceptible nod, a quiet signal that he wasn't alone anymore. The bully saw this shift too, and it rattled him. He had built his moment of dominance on the boy's weakness, but now that weakness was unraveling into strength, and the bully was left exposed. His attempt to regain control faltered, leaving him flailing for authority that no longer existed. Keanu didn't press further. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade. He simply stood there, tall and unwavering, his calm eyes fixed on the bully. That steady gaze was merciless in its gentleness. It didn't condemn, but it didn't excuse either. It reflected the truth so clearly that the bully couldn't hide from it. He shifted from one foot to the other, suddenly smaller, suddenly unsure. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The crew, emboldened by Keanu's presence, no longer looked away. They didn't laugh. They didn't support him. They simply watched, their disapproval radiating in quiet waves. The bully was cornered, not by force, but by the undeniable weight of truth. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't feared. He was pitied. The bully's final attempt at saving face came out as little more than a whisper. "Fine. Whatever. Do what you want," he muttered, his voice stripped of authority. He turned slightly, avoiding Keanu's eyes, unable to bear the reflection staring back at him. The shame was too much. He had strutted into this moment with arrogance, believing he could control the room with mockery, but now he was leaving it as nothing more than a defeated man, revealed for what he truly was. The silence that followed him as he stepped back wasn't the silence of fear, but of rejection. No one admired him. No one respected him. He had lost everything he had sought to gain, undone not by violence, but by kindness that cut deeper than cruelty ever could. And in that moment, the balance of the room shifted completely. The young actor stood with renewed strength. The crew exhaled, releasing the tension that had gripped them. And Keanu, still calm, still steady, remained at the center, not as a conqueror basking in victory, but as a man who had simply reminded the world of a simple truth: dignity will always outlast cruelty. The bully's defeat wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, inevitable, and absolute. The weight of silence that settled over the studio after Keanu's words was unlike anything anyone there had experienced before. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of the shallow energy that had been driving the day up until now. The crew members who had been scurrying around earlier, whispering among themselves about the bully's antics, now stood frozen in place. Even the cameras, though still recording, seemed to hum softer, as though they too were aware something meaningful had just happened. The bully, the once smug and loud-voiced actor, sat slumped in his chair, his face drained of color. He had spent the better part of the day flaunting his arrogance, cracking cruel jokes, and undermining those he thought beneath him, only to be dismantled in a way he could never have predicted. Not through anger, not through threats, but through kindness that cut deeper than any sharp word ever could. The room, once brimming with bravado and tension, was now filled with introspection. People exchanged glances, not in gossip, but in recognition. Recognition that they had just witnessed something transformative. The bully tried to shift in his seat, as though preparing to rebound with another witty jab, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he looked uncertain, small, even. He avoided eye contact with Keanu, who remained composed, his presence neither triumphant nor gloating. Instead, Keanu's expression radiated calm empathy, as though to say, "I didn't do this to hurt you, I did this so you could see yourself." It was a look that unsettled the bully more than outright anger ever would have. Around them, the atmosphere grew heavy with the weight of that truth. Members of the production team who had endured the bully's mockery in silence felt something loosen within themselves, a quiet empowerment, the realization that cruelty could be met and undone without needing to replicate it. For them, Keanu's actions weren't just about defending himself, they were about reshaping the entire environment they were forced to work in. Slowly, a ripple began to form. One of the younger crew members, who had been mocked earlier in the day for stumbling over a cable, straightened their shoulders, emboldened by what they'd just seen. Another, who had laughed nervously at the bully's cruel jokes out of fear of standing out, now avoided his gaze, refusing to feed the ego that had once thrived on their forced reactions. The shift was subtle, but it was undeniable. The bully, who had once fed on control and humiliation, found himself stripped of the very audience he needed. His authority wasn't destroyed by confrontation, it was dismantled by the quiet courage that Keanu's kindness had inspired in everyone else. It was as though the entire studio had been liberated in that single moment. As the silence continued, Keanu leaned back slightly in his chair, not to bask in the atmosphere, but to ground it. He knew the bully wasn't the only one who needed to absorb the lesson. Everyone in the room needed to feel it, to carry it forward. He didn't rush to fill the air with words or gestures. He let the weight of his choice linger, giving the bully the space to confront himself without being pushed further into shame. That, perhaps, was the most disarming part of Keanu's approach. He wasn't interested in victory. He was interested in transformation. And in that stillness, the crew began to realize that kindness wasn't weakness, nor was it passive. It was the strongest, most radical form of power they had ever seen. By the time the director called for a short break, the room felt different. Conversations started again, but they were softer, more genuine. The crew spoke to one another with respect instead of fear, with camaraderie instead of competition. The bully, still hunched in his chair, avoided speaking altogether. His usual arrogance evaporated. He looked around the room and saw no allies, no smirks encouraging his behavior, only silence and distance. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention. Keanu, on the other hand, had returned to his script, flipping through the pages as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He hadn't delivered his words for praise or applause. He had simply lived them. And that, more than anything, was what left the deepest mark on those who had witnessed it. In that moment, Keanu hadn't just destroyed a bully, he had reshaped an entire room. The diner that had moments ago been a storm of tension was now strangely calm. The chatter of utensils against plates resumed, but it carried a new softness, as though everyone was careful not to disturb the fragile air that had settled. Keanu remained seated, his hands wrapped loosely around his coffee cup, eyes lowered as if reflecting on what had just unfolded. The bully sat a few tables away, shoulders hunched, his earlier arrogance completely drained. He looked smaller now, not just physically but spiritually, like a man who had been stripped of the armor he had long hidden behind. Customers whispered, not in ridicule but in awe, their glances shifting between Keanu and the man he had silenced, as though unsure who the true subject of this quiet victory was. The fluorescent lights hummed above, bathing everything in an almost surreal glow. The young waitress who had been the subject of the bully's cruelty returned, her hands trembling slightly as she set a fresh pot of coffee on Keanu's table. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her eyes moist but shining with relief. For her, it wasn't just about the confrontation, it was about being seen, defended, and reminded that kindness still had power in a world where cruelty often went unchecked. Keanu lifted his gaze and offered a smile so gentle it disarmed her lingering fear. He didn't speak grand words, didn't announce his victory. His silence was his triumph, for it carried the weight of restraint, the depth of wisdom, and the unshakable presence of a man who had faced shadows darker than this diner's bully. In the far corner, the bully stirred in his seat, his fingers fidgeting with his napkin as if trying to shred away the shame. He caught Keanu's eyes for a fleeting moment, and in that glance, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't gloating. It was recognition, the kind that tells a man, "I see your brokenness," even when you try to hide it behind cruelty. For the first time, the bully's face softened. His jaw unclenched, his shoulders eased, and he looked away, not in defiance but in thought. That single exchange felt more powerful than any fight could have been, more lasting than any insult. It was as though Keanu had dismantled him not with fists but with compassion, forcing him to confront the hollowness of his own actions. The waitress, now steadier, began to serve the other patrons again. Yet everywhere she went, people met her with a new kindness, smiles, polite nods, and quiet words of encouragement. The ripple effect of Keanu's presence had spread. By defending her, he hadn't just stopped one bully. He had reminded everyone in that diner of the better versions of themselves they often forget to be. Even the cook in the back, who had peeked out during the tension, wore a smile as he flipped pancakes with an extra flourish. The energy had shifted, transformed from fear to warmth, from cruelty to solidarity. And Keanu, still calm, still centered, seemed almost apart from it all, as though he were only the spark that had reignited something already buried deep in each of them. When Keanu finally rose from his seat, sliding a few bills onto the table, the room grew quieter again, almost reverent. He adjusted his coat, glanced at the young waitress, and gave her a small nod that said everything words could not. She smiled back, this time without trembling, standing a little taller than before. As he walked toward the door, his footsteps echoed faintly, and every pair of eyes followed him, not in celebrity awe but in respect for what he had done, not by humiliating a man, but by restoring dignity to someone who had lost it under another's cruelty. The bully remained seated, still silent, but his gaze was locked on Keanu, as though he knew he had witnessed something rare, the destruction of cruelty not through violence, but through kindness that demanded he change. The months that followed the incident were filled with quiet ripples of change. For most, it was just another viral moment lost in the constant churn of social media, but for those who had been in that ballroom, the memory remained vivid. They remembered the hush that fell after Keanu's words, the way the bully's smirk faltered into silence, and the way kindness had struck sharper than any cruel retort could. It wasn't simply that Keanu had won the exchange, it was that he redefined what victory looked like. No shouting, no chest thumping, no vengeful spectacle. Just calm truth spoken with compassion. And that, strangely enough, was harder to forget than any heated confrontation would have been. For Keanu, life went on as it always did. He slipped back into his usual rhythm, riding his motorcycle through quiet Los Angeles streets, sharing coffee with strangers, pausing to sign autographs when he noticed fans waiting nervously. Yet, beneath the surface, he was aware of something shifting. People began to approach him not only with admiration but with gratitude. They shared stories of how they had replayed his speech in their heads before standing up to their own bullies, at work, at school, even at home. Parents told him their children had asked, "Why didn't he get angry? Why was he so kind?" and had to explain that kindness can be power too. He realized that a single night had sparked conversations far beyond that ballroom. The bully himself faded into obscurity, though not before attempting a few desperate interviews. The world, however, was unmoved. The charm that once carried him shrank under the weight of his pettiness, and the more he tried to spin the story, the more it backfired. People were uninterested in his excuses. The narrative had already crystallized. He became a cautionary tale, a reminder that cruelty, when exposed in the light of kindness, often collapses under its own weight. What once seemed powerful now seemed small, and Keanu's quiet dignity had ensured that this outcome required no humiliation, no retaliation, just truth. Years later, when people recalled the incident, they didn't even remember the bully's name. But they remembered Keanu's words. They remembered the calmness in his voice, the way he had carried himself with both strength and gentleness. Some described it as the day kindness destroyed cruelty. Others framed it as the night Keanu showed what real power looks like. Either way, the story became less about a single event and more about a lesson, etched into memory, carried into new contexts, retold as an example of what to do when faced with mockery or disrespect. Keanu, ever humble, downplayed it whenever the topic arose, but deep down, he understood the truth. Sometimes the smallest choices ripple the farthest. And so, the story closed not with fanfare or a dramatic curtain drop, but with a legacy that lived quietly in countless hearts. For some, it was a reminder to fight back with dignity. For others, a lesson in self-restraint. For Keanu himself, it was simply another affirmation of the path he had always chosen, to meet the world not with bitterness, but with compassion. He never set out to destroy anyone. Yet, in the end, that was exactly what he did. The bully crumbled not because of Keanu's wrath, but because of his kindness. And in that paradox lay the truest form of strength.